Hello and welcome to the Ellen Made Book Club and my December wrap-up. I want to talk about the books that I read in December, and I also want to follow up on my 10 before the end list of books that I was planning to read before the end of 2024. I also want to give you an update on my January TBR because I feel like things might change a little bit, and that is important information that I need to share with you. So let's start with my 10 before the end and let's see which ones I got to. I didn't read anything more in The Grandmothers by Doris Lessing, but that's completely fine because I'm in no rush, and this was kind of, it was either this one or Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi, I want to say, but it's pronounced Gyasi, I think. I didn't read any of these two. The Grandmothers is fine, and Homegoing I'm going to read in January with Chelsea at Libraries and Lattes, and so that's accounted for, but I haven't read anything in that. James by Percial Everett I did start listening to on audiobook, but I felt like I had to concentrate a lot to keep up with what was being said. So yeah, it would just be helpful to have the physical text in front of me while I'm listening. So I'm hoping I will get that from the library pretty soon. Hours by Phillip B. Williams. I have not read anything more in. This is pretty much just taking up half of my nightstand and just being a constant reminder to me that I'm not reading it. I need to put it back on my shelf until I feel ready to read it, because at the moment it's just like making me feel bad even though I really want to read it. But yeah, now is maybe not the time, so I don't need to have it in my face the whole time. Lanny I did start reading. I read about 20 pages, I think. I started reading it in my Try a Chapter video with a couple of other books on this list, and yeah, I really enjoyed it, but I haven't continued reading anything more in it. Mink River by Brian Doyle I have not read anything in, but I do have it back from the library, and I have extended the loan on it, so hopefully I can continue this in January. White Cat Black Dog by Kerry Wilkinson I also read the start of in that Try a Chapter video, and I really enjoyed it. This was a really fun time, and I have since finished that first short story and also read the second one. I think there are 7 in here, so I read about 90 pages total in this book, and I think the first story was better than the second, but the second one was also really good. It's about a couple, 2 elderly men, and one of them is sort of disappearing into the underworld, and the other one has to follow him to try to save him or bring him back. It's a fun time. And yeah, so I did read a little bit more in this, and I'm happy with that. The Winners by Fredrik Backman was the #1 priority read in December, and I am not finished with that one. I hadn't really thought it through when I decided the book club reads for the last 3 months of the year was going to be the Beartown series. I was not aware of how long The Winners is, and I also wasn't factoring in anything about Christmas, New Year's, any kind of holiday in December. But I will be continuing to read that in January, and there will be a book club discussion of it when I'm done. I'm trying not to rush through it because I don't want to put that pressure on myself, and I also don't want to rush through a good book. Crooked Plow by Itamar Vieira Junior I'm still reading. I only have about 60 pages or so left. So I'm thinking I will finish that this weekend, and so far I really enjoyed it. It's a very special book, and yeah, I really like it. It's not as dramatic and weird throughout the whole book as it was at the start of the book. The book opens with these 2 sisters that we're following. They find a knife under their grandmother's bed and they cut their tongues. It's very gross And yeah, but that sort of lays the foundation of these two sisters' bond that they will have throughout their life, because one of them can't speak, and so the other sister has to speak for her, and they have like a special connection. And yeah, their father is a healer, so there's also that aspect of it, and like people coming to their house and needing help with things. And there are spirits and spirituality and things like that. It's set in rural Brazil a few decades after the abolition of slavery there, and they are working there as farmers, and they are just stuck in this system that continues to take advantage of them, and they have very few rights. They are allowed to live on this land as long as they work, but they are not paid any money, and they can't build things. And yeah, so that's definitely a big part of this book as well. So like the weirdness and the dramatic start of it is not really representative of how the rest of the book is, but it is very beautifully written, and I'm really enjoying it. Next up, we have One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig, and this one I did finish. I got it back from the library for my second time, and so I needed to finish it before I had to return it again because there were people in line. It took me a long time to finish, so I feel like a lot of my December reading were sort of eaten up by that book. And I thought it was going to be kind of a quick and easy read. It's a fantasy, but I kind of struggled to keep myself engaged, and like I wanted to finish it because I saw potential in it, and there were some aspects of it that I enjoyed, but I found myself kind of having to force myself to push through. First of all, the main character's name is Elspeth Spindle, and I don't know how someone would make that decision because that is impossible to pronounce. Maybe that's just me, but like Elspeth Spindle. How do you say that without spitting on everybody? Anyways, Elspeth is a young girl, and when she was little, she was infected with this like fever from the mist or whatever, and she has a magic that is illegal in this town where she lives. And then there are these like doctor police people who hunt down kids with magic in them and kill them. And so to sort of protect her, she moves to her aunt and uncle. That was one of the things that was so confusing to me at the start of the book, just like keeping track of her family situation, like all of her half sisters and then siblings, and then there's like a stepmom, and then there's like, it was so confusing to me, and I didn't know at the start of the book if that was important or not. So I was just trying to like make sense of who's who and who's related which way, and I don't know, it was just very confusing because the characters themselves, like her family members, were never clear as characters themselves. They were just like, this half sister is called that and this half sister is called that, but they didn't have any characteristics or like personality traits or anything. They were just there, and they were just names, like cluttering my brain. And then there's also a royal family situation, which is pretty much the same thing. I didn't find that they as characters were very clear either. And then there's the whole cards system, which is the legal kind of magic. I don't know, all of that was like a good concept, but I just was very confused by how it was explained. Basically, there are 78 cards, I think, in total, and there are 12 different values that these cards can have, and the most common one there are 12 of, and the rarest one there's only one of. And Elspeth also has this like monster in her head, and so she can see the cards like in colors. And so let's say there's a blue card and there's only one blue card, and then there's 2 yellow cards and 3 pink cards, for example, and it goes that way all down to 12, and in total that makes 78. But it took me so long to figure out that that was what it meant, because it just kept alternating between like, yeah, there are 12 cards, And then there were 78 cards, and then there's 12 cards again. And I was just like, what, how, what? So that was another thing that was very confusing to me, and that was a very like central part to the story. I haven't even gotten to what the premise of the book is, because all of these things were just so confusing to me. So I was like, what is the story here? What is the aim? What is the like, I was just getting stuck and like bogged down with all these details that didn't make sense. And then there were parts where the writing was just inconsistent or like didn't make sense to me. Like, it's written in the first person, so we're seeing this from Elspeth's perspective. And so let's say I'm Elspeth and I'm standing here, and then there's a man over here, and then there's a boy coming to stand in between me as the main character and the man, so that the man can't see me. But then it goes on to describe how those two people are looking at each other, and like, I'm assuming the boy has his back to me, so how can I see what he's doing with his eyes? And the man is blocked from my view because the boy is standing in the middle of us, so that, I mean, if the man can't see me and I can't see the man, and it's just so unnecessary because it has no impact on the story whatsoever, but it was just things like that that just didn't make sense. And so that just takes me out of the story. I want to be immersed in that world and just like forget, you know, reality, and things like that just makes me think of physics. Like, that's not the point of a fantasy book. So those were some things that were annoying to me in terms of the writing. And this is like on top of everyone having really weird names and constantly mentioning what eye color everyone has. But more important than that, I thought that the story was lacking in like urgency and purpose. Like, I wasn't invested. I didn't really care about any of the characters, and I didn't have a sense of like, what's the goal here? What are we working towards? Like, there was no specific timeline or deadline. There was a date being mentioned, like it would be best to do this by winter solstice, but that was just like mentioned once. So it wasn't like, come on, let's go. We only have 1 week. We only have 3 days. We only have this much time left. There was no sense of like, we're getting close to the deadline now. It was just kind of, yeah, it would be good to do it in a bit. Like, that doesn't create a sense of urgency for me as a reader. And I also didn't really understand why. Like, the main character wants this monster gone from her head, which, like, yeah, I get that. But also, she's had that monster in her head for, I think, 11 years or something. It might not be the best time, and it's getting worse, but it's also getting worse because she's trying to get rid of it, and like, because they're doing all the things that they're doing. And so that's also not like urgent. Like, if it's been fine for 11 years, what's the hurry? Like, and then there's also an aspect of like saving the children, but I don't know who these children are or like what the stakes are. And like, I understand that children being killed is not a good thing, but it's not mentioned over and over again to make it like super clear that we're doing this to save the children. So that's just kind of like, yeah, and also the children. I don't know. I see so much potential in this story, and I think the magic system is cool and the premise is cool and the plot itself has good bones. I just wish it was more polished in the writing and that it made sense and wasn't like bringing me out of the story over and over again. And I also wish that there was more urgency and more purpose and like, what's the goal here? What are we doing? What is the end goal of this adventure that we're on? That being said, I do want to read the second part in this duology. I have my reservation on it at the library, and so I will read that whenever that comes through. I've been told that the second book is better than the first, so let's hope that it is. I also listened to an audiobook via NetGalley called Home is Where the Lies Live by Kerry Wilkinson. I was wanting a thriller, and I'm just like starting to look at NetGalley, and this was one that I could get. So I figured, why not give it a shot? And yeah, it's a neighborhood thriller. It was good enough, and it was kind of easy listening, and most of the narrators did a pretty good job. I was not on the edge of my seat, and I was not like super intrigued by anything, but it wasn't a struggle to finish. I was just like listening to it while doing other things. And so, yeah, the first perspective is of a woman who moves into a new neighborhood with her husband, and he has been there for a week before she arrives, and he has a room that he locks, which is weird. And so that's one perspective. And then we also have another woman who has been living in this neighborhood for longer. She has a boyfriend or partner, and she also has a teenage daughter. And then there's a man who has also lived in this neighborhood for longer, and he has a little girl. His wife was killed a few years back, and he was always the prime suspect, but he maintains he didn't do it, and he was never convicted of anything. And he has this gun in his house that he takes out every so often and looks at. And yeah, the book starts out with this neighborhood party, and a gun goes off and something horrible happens. And so then we go back in time like a week or so, I think, when this first woman moves into this neighborhood, and we work our way forward until the party. Overall, I thought it was fine. I thought the writing was decent, and the perspectives of these different characters was fine, and the story was fine, and the plot was fine, and all of that. I just wasn't on the edge of my seat. It was just a story, and it was fine, but nothing special. The final book I finished in December is The Mare by Angharad Hampshire, and this book I thought was fantastic. I thought it was going to be a very heavy and dense read, but I flew through this. I didn't want to put it down. The chapters are very short, and the book itself spans decades, so we're moving along pretty quickly between each chapter. And yeah, I just thought it was so well done. It is almost surface level and simplistic and neutral in a way, in the way that it's written, but it's also got meta layers to the story, and I just think it's so well done. It is very uncomfortable to read, and it leaves you with a lot of questions. It doesn't give you answers, and it doesn't give you a clear discussion on what's right and wrong. I mean, obviously, in terms of the Second World War, in the grand scheme of things, it's very black and white. There's a right side and a wrong side. But, as in any situation, if you look closely enough, you're going to find some gray areas. And this book looks very closely at just one individual in the whole war. And so we're going to find some gray areas. And that's very uncomfortable. And that doesn't mean that any of her actions are forgiven or excused or even understood, but it's not really about her. I think it's more about us and things we maybe think we would never do, and it would be foolish to think that we are not susceptible to things going on in a society that makes people do what she did. There are a lot of things to be said about this book, so I'm going to do a separate video with my review of this and reflections, because yeah, it's a very thought-provoking book. Overall, I thought the writing was excellent. It's not lyrical, it's very simple and to the point, but the words and the imagery and the way that the scenes go into each other and the way that the story is told and the underlying messages and all of that, I just think it's a fantastic book. So this is a fictionalized story about a real person called Hermine Braunsteiner, who was a guard in a concentration camp and then escaped after the war and ended up in New York, where she's married to an American man. And then one day a journalist comes knocking on their door and starts asking questions. And that's how her husband finds out that she was a guard in a concentration camp. So that's where the book starts out, with this knock on the door. Then we go back in time and we follow Hermine from the time she's 15 in 1934. And so we have that timeline and perspective. And then the other perspective we have is from her husband, Russell. That timeline starts in 1957, so after the war, when they meet and they go on their first date, and then it spans decades after that. So it's a simple story in a way, but there are just so many layers to it and so many complex questions. There are also so many things that we as readers have to fill in ourselves. And like, if you don't know anything about the Second World War and what happened to people, you're not going to learn about that from this book, because those things are just sort of mentioned. They're very present in this story, but that's not the focus. The focus is on her, and she's one of the perpetrators. And so it's a very weird perspective and an uncomfortable perspective, but it's so fascinating. And I think that the questions that are being asked are very important to be willing to look at, because that's kind of the only way that this could never happen again. It is also very uncomfortable that it's not focused on the victims of the war, and they are also very present, but they're also very distant. They're described in a very dehumanizing way. And so all of that is also very uncomfortable to read, and there is a lot of horrible things happening to people. Like, that's not just because I read this quickly, that doesn't mean that this isn't a very heavy book and a very heavy topic. It's very difficult to explain. But I mean, we are following a villain basically, but she's also a completely regular person. And so it's asking questions about forgiveness, and could this have been anyone? Could this have been you or me? The chapters that are written from Russell's perspective, those are directed at Hermine. So so he says you, which is directed at her, but as a reader, it feels directed at me. And it's very eerie, but it's very effective, because it just makes that point even stronger, that this was a regular person, or seemed like, at least. And in any other context, she might have just gone on to be a nurse like she wanted to. I highly recommend this book. Be aware that there are brutal things happening. It's set during the Second World War, and some of it is taking place in a concentration camp, so it's not a light-hearted read in any way. I just want people to read it, and I think it's important. I think that it raises important questions, and we need to be willing to ask ourselves those questions. I feel like that was a very weird review, but that's the best I can do right now. And so let's move on to my January TBR update, which, very important news. So the TBR that I picked out in my January TBR video was this stack of books right here. We have Homegoing, Assistant to the Villain, Forgotten on Sunday, and House of Fortune. And I still want to read all these, but I also had 3 new releases on audiobook that I wanted to get to. And I also need to finish the winners. Then I also had some reservations from the library that all just came through at the same time. The Other Side of Night by Adam Hamdy. Where am I holding this? It was not a good audiobook, so I want to read this as a physical copy instead. I also put in a request for my local library to purchase Strong Female Character by Fern Brady, which is a memoir. Then I was also in line for Bunny by Mona Awad, which is another book that I really want to read. So now I'm very confused and I don't know where to start, because now I have all of these to read in January, plus the winners, which is 20 hours left on the audiobook, and also the 3 new releases on audiobook. And that's just not realistic. So that's my update on that chaos, and I don't know exactly what I will read, but I guess I just have a good stack of books that I can pick and choose from once I get through Crooked Plow and Homegoing. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're having a fantastic day, and I will see you in the next one. Bye. Let's just do this now. It's 9 o'clock. Great. Okay. Okay.